I retired on a Friday after 32 years, driving long-haul routes across the country. I called my son Tyler that same evening to celebrate, the way I'd called him after every major milestone since his mother and I divorced when he was 12. The call went straight to voicemail. I texted. Nothing delivered. By Saturday morning, I understood clearly what had happened. My number had been blocked, deliberately, sometime in the roughly 18 hours since we'd last spoken normally. I didn't know why. I had no warning, no argument, no specific incident I could point to as the cause. I want to tell you what I eventually discovered, and what I did about it, because the answer wasn't what I expected, and neither was where I ended up finding it. I drove long-haul routes for 32 years, gone for stretches of 10 to 14 days at a time, a career that provided steadily but demanded real sacrifice from the relationship with my son, especially after his mother and I split when he was 12. I want to be honest that the divorce reshaped our closeness considerably, custody arrangements limiting me to roughly every third weekend when I was actually in town between routes, a schedule I fought to honor consistently even when exhaustion made it genuinely difficult. Tyler and I built, across his teenage years and into his 20s, a relationship I believed was solid, despite the physical distance my career regularly imposed. I want to describe a specific tradition we maintained despite the schedule constraints. Whenever I was home during one of my scheduled weekends, we'd drive to a diner near his mother's house for breakfast, just the two of us, a ritual that became, over the years, the specific marker of our continued closeness, regardless of how many weeks had passed between visits. He called it road breakfast, a small joke about my career that became, over time, genuinely meaningful shorthand for the reliable presence I worked hard to maintain within an inherently unreliable schedule. I want to describe the months leading up to my retirement, because I don't think the blocking happened in a vacuum, whatever its ultimate cause turned out to be. Tyler and I had spoken regularly during that final year of my career, planning what retirement might look like, discussing whether I'd finally have more consistent time for visits once the constant road schedule ended. He seemed genuinely enthusiastic about that prospect during those calls, nothing in his tone suggesting the sudden severance that arrived the day after my actual last route. I remember one specific call, about 4 months before my actual retirement, where Tyler mentioned, with what struck me as genuine excitement, that we might finally be able to do road breakfast every single week instead of every third weekend, once my schedule opened up completely. That specific enthusiasm, so clearly present in his voice just months before the sudden silence, made the eventual blocking feel even more disorienting when it actually happened, given how directly it contradicted everything he'd seemed to be looking forward to. I want to describe those first weeks of unexplained silence, because the not knowing was, in some ways, harder than any specific painful explanation would have been. I reached out through his fiancée, Rachel, someone I'd maintained a cordial relationship with throughout their engagement, and even she seemed genuinely uncertain about the specific cause, telling me only that Tyler had become suddenly, uncharacteristically quiet about me over that particular weekend, declining to explain further even to her. I spent those weeks running through every possible explanation I could construct, some remark I might have made during our last call that had landed wrong, some financial matter, some resentment about the divorce years finally surfacing after decades of apparent acceptance. None of my guesses felt complete, and the uncertainty itself became its own specific, grinding source of anxiety. I remember driving past our old diner during that stretch, a habit I'd maintained even after retirement, simply because the route felt familiar, and sitting in my truck outside it for nearly 20 minutes, unable to bring myself to go in alone, the specific place too closely associated with a relationship I no longer understood the status of. I hadn't cried in years before that particular afternoon, sitting in a parking lot outside a diner that had once meant weekly, reliable connection. About a month into the silence, genuinely desperate for some explanation, I called Tyler's mother, Sandra, someone I hadn't spoken with directly in several years, beyond brief, functional exchanges around holidays. She was surprised to hear from me, and more surprised still by what I was asking. She told me she hadn't heard anything specific from Tyler about a falling out, though she mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd seemed unusually stressed lately about something related to his own upcoming wedding planning. Financial pressure he'd apparently been managing quietly rather than openly discussing with either of us. Sandra and I hadn't had a genuinely warm conversation in years, our post-divorce relationship having settled into a kind of polite, minimal contact arrangement neither of us had actively maintained beyond necessity. I noticed, during that specific call, a small return of the collaborative concern we'd once shared as co-parents decades earlier, both of us genuinely worried about our son, despite our own long-settled separate lives. The actual explanation arrived nearly 6 weeks into the silence, through an unexpected source. Tyler's best friend since childhood, Marcus, who I'd stayed loosely connected with over the years, and who finally, hesitantly, agreed to tell me what he understood of the situation. Marcus explained that Tyler had learned, through a conversation with his mother around that same weekend, that I'd apparently declined to contribute financially toward his upcoming wedding, a request Sandra had relayed on his behalf weeks earlier that I had, in fact, never actually received, my phone having malfunctioned during that specific stretch of my final working days, dropping several messages I never saw. Tyler had apparently interpreted my silence on that request, my failure to respond in any way to what he understood as a direct, meaningful ask, as a final, deliberate rejection, arriving as it did right at my retirement, a moment he'd told Marcus he'd hoped might finally mean more consistent presence rather than continued absence, dressed up in a new form. Marcus told me, hesitantly, that Tyler had specifically said something like, "Even now, with nothing left to keep him on the road, he still can't be bothered to answer me." A comment that captured, more precisely than anything else Marcus relayed, exactly how deeply the perceived silence had wounded him, landing directly on top of decades of accumulated resentment about the trucking years that Tyler had apparently never fully processed or discussed with me directly. I want to lay out the full misunderstanding clearly, because I think the specific mechanics matter for understanding both what happened and what it eventually took to resolve it. Sandra had relayed Tyler's wedding contribution request to me through a text message sent to a phone that had, unbeknownst to me, stopped receiving messages properly for nearly 2 weeks due to a carrier issue I only discovered and resolved after my actual retirement date. Tyler, waiting for any response and receiving none, concluded I'd simply chosen silence as my answer, a conclusion that, combined with decades of accumulated hurt about my long-haul absences during his childhood, apparently crystallized into a final, decisive rejection on his part, rather than any recognition that a simple technical failure might explain my silence. I remember calling my carrier immediately after Marcus explained all this, sitting on hold for nearly 40 minutes, needing concrete confirmation of the exact malfunction dates before I trusted my own memory of when the issue had actually occurred. The representative confirmed a service interruption affecting text delivery for exactly the window in question, evidence I would later use, carefully, to demonstrate the misunderstanding's actual mechanical cause rather than relying purely on my own account, which I understood Tyler might reasonably doubt given how thoroughly he'd already settled into the rejection narrative. Once Marcus explained the actual sequence of events, I didn't immediately try to contact Tyler directly, understanding that a blocked number wouldn't suddenly become receptive to my explanation simply because I now understood its cause. I wrote a detailed letter instead, explaining the phone malfunction specifically, including a screenshot from my carrier confirming the technical issue's exact dates, and sent it through Marcus with an explicit request that Tyler read it whenever he felt ready, with no expectation of an immediate response. I want to describe writing that letter specifically, because it took me nearly 3 full drafts to get the tone right. My first attempt, I recognized rereading it, carried too much defensive justification, cataloging my efforts across his childhood in a way that risked sounding like I was arguing, rather than genuinely trying to explain. I rewrote it twice more, eventually settling on something simpler, the factual explanation about the phone, an acknowledgement that I understood how the silence must have landed, given our history, and an open invitation for the harder conversation about that history whenever he felt ready for it. Tyler didn't respond to that letter for nearly 2 more months, a silence that tested my patience considerably, though I understood, intellectually, that trust rebuilding after this specific kind of misunderstanding, layered on top of decades of earlier absence, couldn't reasonably be rushed by my own growing impatience. I spent those additional months in a genuinely difficult limbo, uncertain whether the letter had even been read, uncertain whether Tyler's silence now reflected continued anger, or simply the time he needed to process an explanation that complicated a narrative he'd apparently already emotionally settled into. I filled those months with whatever distraction I could manage, taking on small home repair projects I'd been postponing for years, anything to occupy the specific anxious energy of waiting for a response I had no ability to hasten. I remember checking my phone compulsively during the first few weeks, a habit I eventually forced myself to break, understanding that constant checking wasn't actually bringing the response any closer, only prolonging my own daily anxiety. During that same difficult stretch, facing genuine uncertainty about whether the relationship would ever fully repair, I made a decision I'd been loosely considering even before the blocking happened: retiring abroad, specifically to the Philippines, where my modest trucking pension could stretch considerably further than it did in my expensive home state. I want to be honest that part of my decision was influenced by the painful uncertainty with Tyler, understanding that waiting indefinitely near the phone for a response I couldn't control wasn't serving my own well-being, and that building something deliberate elsewhere might be healthier than simply remaining suspended in anxious limbo. I researched carefully despite the emotional turmoil, treating the financial planning with the same discipline I'd once applied to route logistics across 3 decades of long-haul driving, checking visa requirements, cost of living comparisons, healthcare access, refusing to let the personal crisis push me into a hastier decision than the actual move deserved. I moved 4 months after sending that letter, still without any response from Tyler, settling into a small coastal apartment and beginning the same kind of deliberate community building I've heard described in other similar stories. A local retiree group, a modest routine, genuine effort to construct a life independent of the painful uncertainty I'd left partially unresolved back home. Tyler finally called, unblocking my number without warning, about 6 weeks after my move. He told me, quietly, that he'd read the letter almost immediately after receiving it through Marcus, but had needed considerably longer than he expected to actually process it emotionally. Embarrassed, he admitted, by how quickly he'd concluded rejection, rather than considering a simpler, more innocent explanation. I remember exactly where I was when that call came through, sitting on my small apartment balcony, coffee in hand, watching the street below wake up for the day. An ordinary morning interrupted by a name on my caller ID I hadn't seen in over 5 months. My hands were shaking slightly as I answered, uncertain whether the call meant reconciliation or simply a final, more direct explanation before permanent distance. That first call after months of silence was difficult, both of us navigating genuine hurt on both sides, his at the assumed rejection, mine at the swift, unexplained severance that had followed decades of consistent, if imperfect, effort on my part. Tyler admitted, during that call, that the blocked number hadn't really been about the wedding contribution specifically, but about a much older, accumulated frustration about my trucking years finally finding an outlet through what felt, in that specific moment, like one final confirmation of a lifelong pattern of absence. He said understanding the phone malfunction hadn't erased that older frustration, but it had made him realize he owed me an honest conversation about the full history rather than a sudden, silent verdict delivered without any explanation. I asked him, gently, why he'd waited nearly 6 weeks after my move to actually make the call, rather than reaching out immediately once he'd finished processing the letter itself. He told me, honestly, that watching me actually follow through on the retirement move, building an entirely new life rather than simply waiting anxiously by the phone, had somehow made him feel safer initiating contact, less worried that reaching out would be read as simple guilt-driven obligation rather than something he genuinely wanted to do for its own sake. We had, over the following weeks, several genuinely difficult conversations about those trucking years specifically. Conversations I don't think either of us had ever had as directly before this crisis forced them into the open. Tyler described specific memories I hadn't fully understood the weight of at the time. birthdays where I was on the road, a difficult stretch during his parents' divorce, when he said he genuinely needed more consistent presence than my custody schedule allowed, a specific accumulated loneliness that he said had never fully resolved even once he'd become an adult with his own increasingly independent life. He mentioned one specific birthday, his 14th, when a scheduling conflict had kept me on a route through what should have been our regular weekend. The first time in years, road breakfast had been genuinely cancelled rather than simply delayed. He said that particular disappointment, small in isolation, had somehow become a kind of emotional shorthand he'd carried for years afterward, evidence, in his mind, that even our most reliable tradition could ultimately be sacrificed to the demands of my career whenever circumstances required it. I didn't try to defend the career choices that had created those specific gaps, understanding that defending them wouldn't actually address the genuine hurt underneath his account. I simply listened, acknowledged the specific losses he described, and told him honestly that I understood, now, why a simple unanswered text about wedding funds had landed with such disproportionate weight, given everything it apparently represented underneath. Tyler and Rachel visited 4 months ago. Their honeymoon extended slightly to include time here specifically, the first in-person visit since the entire crisis began. I watched him navigate the local market with genuine curiosity, watched him ask questions about my daily routine here, with an attentiveness I hadn't experienced from him in years. Evidence, I think, that the forced honesty of those difficult post-reconciliation conversations had actually deepened our relationship beyond where it stood even before the blocking happened. He told me, on his last evening here, that he finally understood the trucking years not as simple absence, but as a specific, complicated sacrifice, made for reasons he'd never fully asked me to explain until this whole crisis forced the conversation. I want to describe one specific moment from that visit that I think captures the changed relationship better than any general description could. We found a small diner near my apartment, not unlike our old spot back home, and Tyler suggested, without any prompting from me, that we make it our new road breakfast, a small but deliberate act of continuity that told me, more clearly than any words could have, that he'd genuinely chosen to rebuild, rather than simply tolerate a strained reconciliation out of obligation. If your own family relationship has suffered from a sudden, unexplained rupture, I want to tell you what this specific experience taught me. Sometimes the visible trigger, a blocked number, an unanswered text, isn't actually the full story, but simply the surface expression of much older, unaddressed hurt finding its release through whatever immediate circumstance happens to be available. I don't think Tyler's reaction was really about a malfunctioning phone. I think it was about 32 years of accumulated absence finally finding a moment specific enough to demand attention. I'd encourage anyone facing something similar to resist the urge to simply argue against the surface trigger, the way I might have if I'd immediately confronted Tyler defensively about the phone malfunction alone. Understanding and addressing the surface cause matters, but I think genuine reconciliation, in situations layered with this kind of older accumulated history, requires patience for the fuller conversation underneath, even when that fuller conversation takes considerably longer to arrive than the initial crisis itself did. If you're facing your own version of sudden, confusing rejection from someone you love, I hope you find the patience I eventually managed, resisting the urge to immediately demand explanation, and the willingness, once explanation does arrive, to listen to the fuller history underneath it, rather than simply defending your own account of events. Road breakfast continues here now, a small diner 4,000 miles from where the tradition started, carrying the same weekly reliability it once did decades ago, rebuilt deliberately, rather than simply resumed by accident. I think that deliberateness, more than the tradition's simple continuation, is what actually matters most about where Tyler and I have ended up. I'll see you in the next one. I still keep that carrier confirmation letter, folded small, in my wallet, not out of anger, but as a quiet reminder Some misunderstandings need real evidence, not just words, to fully undo. Tyler knows it's there. He's never asked me to throw it away, and I think that says more about where we've landed than either of us has needed to put into words.